皆様こんにちは。ベーカーのマッケンジー法律事務所パートナーのMasumotoです。本日は前回に引き続きまして国際仲裁ビデオシリーズ東京ミーツベトナムと題しまして弊社ハノイオフィスパートナーのTri Quach弁護士とアソシエイトのQuan Hoang弁護士をスピーカーに迎えましてお届けさせていただきます。なお前回と同様英語で進めさせていただきますが最後に日本語で要約をさせていただきますので最後までご覧になっていただけますと幸いです。So, hi Dom, Chi and Quan. Please continue your conversation.
ありがとうございます。So thanks again for all your insight in part one. The next question in this part two is, could you let us know about any current trends or news in Vietnam that our clients should be aware of?
Certainly, Dom. There are quite a few interesting developments in Vietnam's legal and arbitration landscape right now. First is that there are ongoing reforms to promote arbitration. For example, the scope of what can be resolved by arbitration is expanding. Disputes arising from commercial activities relating to land can now be handled by Vietnamese commercial arbitration, thanks to the amended land law in 2024. Public-private partnership contracts and related agreements are also arbitrable under the PPP law in 2020. And even certain labor-related contracts like non-disclosure agreements and non-compete agreements are now eligible for arbitration. Digitalization is another big trend. VIAC's new e-case platform allows parties to file documents electronically, manage case files securely, and monitor their cases in real time. Integrated notifications for hearings and deadlines are synced with users' work calendars, and this really helps to reduce administrative burdens and improves the overall user experience. We are also seeing new institutions emerge, such as we mentioned, the upcoming arbitration centers of the International Financial Center. One notable feature is that parties can agree to waive their right to request courts to set aside awards rendered by these centers, and this could make the process even more efficient. On the judicial side, as of July 2025, all district courts have been replaced by 335 regional courts, which now handle almost all arbitration-related matters, including requests for recognition and enforcement of foreign arbitral awards. However, the power to annul or to set aside domestic arbitral awards has been consolidated in just 3 municipal courts in Hanoi, Da Nang, and Ho Chi Minh City. And this centralization is expected to improve consistency and expertise in handling arbitration cases. So overall, these reforms and innovations are making arbitration more accessible, efficient, and attractive for both domestic and international parties in Vietnam. Thanks, Don.
Thanks so much for that insight. Leading on from there, I wondered whether you have any practical tips or advice for Japanese companies who are negotiating with counterparties in Vietnam, especially in a contentious context.
For the negotiations, I believe the strategy should vary from case to case. However, for a Japanese company that is going to enter into a negotiation with a Vietnamese party, we do have some practical tips and suggestions to make. And one of them is really about the decision-making process of the Vietnamese party. Now, for some Vietnamese party, especially state-owned company or for some state-funded projects, sometimes the contracting party is not really the final decision maker. The decision maker could be someone outside of the company, could be someone in the supervising authority or from the parent's company. So it is highly recommended for the Japanese company to make sure that you understand who is the decision maker in the Vietnamese party before you enter into the negotiations. The second practical tip that we want to make is really about making sure that you produce a good written record of the negotiation, which means that you maintain a good record of all communications between the parties, requests, letters from one party to another parties, meeting minutes between the parties. This is critical if the matter escalates to arbitrations. And this is also important to preserve the right. For example, the statute of limitations under Vietnamese law could be just 2 years or 3 years from the times when the dispute arises. So, however, if one party acknowledges his or her obligations even during the negotiation, then the statute of limitation can restart. So it is very important that you have a good and clear record of the negotiations, because it can help you to preserve the right in case a negotiation fails and you have to go to court or arbitration. Another tip is really to use local counsel, because there are some local risks and local issues that you need to address during the negotiation. And perhaps you may also need to outline a good strategy that can address those local issues and risks during the negotiations. And especially in case the negotiation fails, you have to go to court or arbitration. One more practical tip that we wanted to share is really to consider using professional mediator before commencing any legal actions. So Vietnamese parties, they usually often prefer amicable settlements. So professional mediators can help you, can facilitate the discussions between the parties, and can even preserve the relationships of the parties and reduce the costs. Now, more importantly, if the mediation is successful, the mediation agreements between the parties can be recognized by the court and become enforceable in Vietnam.
Thanks, G, for that. So it sounds like there's a lot of similarities actually between Japanese and Vietnamese parties in terms of amicable settlement, but that engaging with local counsel like yourself and teaming up with us might be advisable. Just going on to the last question then. Again, it's on practical tips and advice for our clients. What about those tips and advice about the dispute resolution system?
Again, the strategy should vary from case to case, but we believe there are some common tips, some common practical tips that we wanted to share and that can be applicable to many dispute cases. Number one is really about making sure that you have a good written record about the case. Now, you may want to refrain from using verbal communications with the other party, because verbal communication may or may not be used before local courts or be used before local arbitration centers as an evidence. The admissibility of verbal communications in Vietnam, it is really, really low. Compared to written communications, if you have a written minutes, if you have a written letters, written request, then the admissibility of those letters, minutes before local courts and arbitration centers in Vietnam is much higher. So it is okay, it is totally fine to communicate with the other party verbally. However, the strong suggestion that we wanted to make is that after each verbal communication, you may want to ask the other party to sign certain meeting minutes, or at least you may want to send a written letters to the other party to acknowledge what they have promised to you verbally during the meeting. That could help you significantly in the dispute resolution process. And the second practical tips that we wanted to make is really about the need to check the authority of the other party's representative before you sign any important documents with them, including meeting minutes or settlement agreements or other documents, because the authority of the other party's representative could be a critical issue before the local courts or arbitration centers. If the other party, they can prove that the person who signed certain documents, he or she does not have a proper authority to sign those documents, then the other party may have a strong ground to even deny the validity of those documents. Of course, we strongly suggest you to seek local advice from local counsel when drafting arbitration clauses and other documents, because there are some issues that you may want to include into those clauses and documents, and those issues might not be very clearly provided or regulated under Vietnamese law. For example, liquidated damage is a common concept in other countries. However, it is not clearly recognized and provided under Vietnamese law. Therefore, a local counsel could help you to put the proper wordings into the agreements or documents, and that proper wordings could help you to increase the enforceability of the clause, of the LD, liquidated damage clause, in case you have to refer to that clause before a court or arbitration centers. And of course, you may need to check with the local counsel on the procedure issues during the arbitrations or litigation process, just to mitigate the risk of subsequent non-recognition or setting aside by the Vietnamese court on the procedure ground. This is really important because the major ground for Vietnamese court to set aside a foreign arbitral award is really to refer to the errors that the arbitral panels they made during the arbitration process. And there might be differences between Vietnamese law and the procedures that the arbitral panel they apply during the arbitration process. So the local counsel can look into those differences and identify the high risk area and help you to mitigate the risk as much as possible.
Thank you, Ji and Quan, for such great insight. Over to Mika now to sum up for us.
Thank you, Dom, Ji and Quan. それでは私から簡単にご説明させていただきます。まずベトナムにおける昨今の動向についてですけれども、現在ベトナムでは仲裁促進のための改革が進められておりまして、具体的には仲裁による紛争解決が可能な対象範囲が様々な法律により拡大されてきているということです。また VIAC の e ケースでは e ファイリングが可能であるなどデジタル化も進められているということですし、前回ご説明したように IFC の仲裁センターの設立も予定されているということでした。さらに2025年7月1日をもって10前のディストリクトコートが廃止され、リジョナルコートが設置されたということであり、これらの裁判所が外国の仲裁判断の承認執行といったほぼ全ての仲裁関連事項を取り扱うということです。ただし前回もお話ししましたが、国内の仲裁判断の取り消しについてはハノイ、ダナン、ホーチミンシティの裁判所のみが管轄権を有するということです。次にベトナム企業を相手方とした場合の紛争解決に向けたアドバイスという点につきましては、特に国営建設プロジェクトではカウンターパートが意思決定権者じゃないという場合があり得ますので、意思決定権限者に直接アクセスをする必要があるということです。またコミュニケーションや要求、議事録、契約の履行状況違反事項といったすべての事項について詳細な記録をすべて文書化して残しておくことが、その後何らかの紛争が生じた場合に極めて重要になるということです。また現地の弁護士を早い段階から起用し、やり取りや契約書のレビュー、また戦略的な助言を得ておくなど、紛争に発展してしまった場合であっても権利を失うことがないように事前にしっかりと対応しておく必要があるということでした。さらにベトナム企業は有効的な解決を好む傾向があり、また関係を維持し費用を削減するという観点からも仲裁の前に調停を実施することも検討するべきだということでした。 ベトナム法の下で資格を有する調停人による国内の調停において成立した調停合意は、ベトナムの裁判所による承認執行が可能であるということです。最後に、ベトナムの紛争解決システムに関する助言という点については、繰り返しになりますが、あらゆる事項を文書化し、紛争となった場合に証拠として使用できるように残しておくことが大切であること。また、契約書や議事録等重要な文書に署名をする際には、必ず相手方代表者が署名権利を有しているかどうかを確認する必要があるということです。さらに、契約の仲裁条項や LD 条項、いわゆる損害賠償の予定に関する条項といった特定の条項のドラフトの際には、仲裁手続きにおいてのみならず、その後の仲裁判断の承認・執行の際の執行可能性を高めるためにも、現地の弁護士による法的なアドバイスを求めることをお勧めするということでした。また、仲裁手続きに関しては、現地の弁護士に相談をし、手続き上の理由で後にベトナムの裁判所によって仲裁判断が承認されなかったり、取り消されるといったリスクを最大限軽減しておくことが重要であるということでございました。以上、前回から2回にわたりまして、弊社ハノイオフィスの弁護士をスピーカーに迎え、ベトナムの仲裁実務の概要をお届けさせていただきました。引き続き本ビデオシリーズをご覧いただけますと幸いです。本日はご視聴いただきましてありがとうございました。